Welcome once again to the Brownstone, Wolfe's sanctuary of logic, orchids, and murder. Do tell us where in the world you're listening from, and don't hesitate to share your thoughts. If you enjoy these cases, consider liking and subscribing. Now then, shall we begin? Nero Wolfe and the Murder, Wine and a Walnut Tart. It was 12 minutes past midnight when the phone ripped the Brownstone out of its quiet. Not 11, not 15. 12. I knew because the brass-framed clock on Wolfe's desk said so, ticking with that smug little rhythm that only an expensive clock can get away with. The hands pointed at the hour in perfect alignment, as though they'd been waiting for an excuse. I had just tilted back the last swallow of milk from the glass I'd been coaxing for an hour, and was debating the wisdom of a sandwich raid in Fritz's kitchen. The rain outside had been steady enough to drown my motivation, and the hush inside Wolfe's office had that deep, carpet-soaked thickness that makes every noise sound like a declaration. So when the bell split the silence, it didn't just ring, it swung a cleaver right through it. Phones at that hour don't mean tomorrow's groceries or a last-minute chess partner. They come in 3 varieties: corpses, criminals, or Inspector Kramer, none of them an improvement on milk. Wolfe, who keeps to his rule, a bed by 10, breakfast at 9, orchids from 9 to 11, was upstairs working on digestion and whatever thoughts men like him entertain between lights out and greenhouse. That left me to the telephone. I grabbed it on the 3rd ring, which for me is prompt and for Wolfe is a dead sprint. North 35th, I said, crisp enough to pass for wide awake. The voice that answered was female, and I'd have bet a day's pay it belonged to a woman who didn't often call strange men at midnight. It was tight, quivering, and every syllable seemed to have claw marks on it. "Mr. Goodwin?" she asked, as though she wasn't convinced the name belonged to anyone human. "That's me," I told her. "And before you ask, the janitor's asleep and the cook doesn't answer phones, so you've hit the jackpot. What's the trouble?" "I need to speak to Mr. Wolfe." "Congratulations. So do half the crooks and the entire police department. At this hour, though, he's otherwise engaged. Try me. I'm housebroken, literate, and very nearly polite." Her breathing was sharp in my ear, quick gulps like she'd just sprinted up 10 flights of stairs. "No, he must hear this. Tell him it was a death, served on a silver tray." That was worth putting both feet on the floor. I straightened in the chair, glass forgotten. "Let's slow down, sister. Death? Whose? Where?" "I can't. I don't dare." Her voice cracked. "But it was deliberate. Poison. And the tart, the walnut tart." Her sentence died the way a light bulb does when the filament snaps. A muffled gasp, a scrape, and the line went dead. "Hello?" I barked. Nothing. Just the hiss of rain against the windows, and the faint buzz of the open wire. I jiggled the hook a couple of times, but whoever she was had gone back to her shadows. I put the receiver down with the kind of care you reserve for glass that might shatter, and let out a long whistle. Walnut tart. Not apple, not cherry. A pastry so specific it might as well have been trademarked. Behind me, the stairs creaked with a deliberate rhythm, heavy and measured. Wolfe, wrapped in a maroon silk robe that would have made Caesar jealous, descended 1 step at a time. He looked like a man who had been hauled out of his natural element, which, of course, he had. His element is a bed, breakfast tray delivered by Fritz, and a morning free from interruptions. Midnight calls didn't fit his schedule. His eyes, small and glistening under the heavy lids, fixed on me. "Archie." His tone carried reproach without effort. "Explain." I swiveled in the chair to face him, hands folded like a schoolboy called to task. "We had a visitor by wire, female, nervous, and with a flair for the dramatic. She said there's been a death, deliberate, something about poison served on a silver tray. And just before she cut herself off, she tossed me a walnut tart." Wolfe's brows arched, which in his case was tantamount to a man dropping his jaw to the floor. He crossed the last few feet to his chair, lowering himself into the yellow armchair as though it had been carved to fit him, which, for all I knew, it had. He steepled his fingers against the curve of his stomach. "A walnut tart." He pronounced it as if it were Latin. "That's right. She didn't say eclair or cheesecake. She was firm on the walnuts. I tried to pin her down, but she hung up. Either she fainted, got grabbed, or just lost her nerve." Wolfe's eyes closed briefly, not in sleep, but in thought. Death is too solemn a phenomenon to be described in culinary terms, unless the method of its administration is itself culinary. Poison, then. That was her word too, I said. Poison. Served on a tray. Sounds like somebody's hospitality took a wrong turn. Wolfe opened his eyes again, slow and heavy. You are too glib, Archie. A woman does not call a stranger at midnight to invent a pastry of doom. There will be corroboration. In due course, a corpse will make itself known. Until then, we wait. I couldn't help grinning. That's it? Wait? You don't want me to trace the call, dash out into the storm, nose around the bakeries of Manhattan. He gave me the look that reduces action to ashes. Pfui! Midnight is not the hour for excursions. Sit down. If she calls again, you will take the message with more restraint. I dropped back into the red leather chair, letting my grin linger just long enough to irritate him. Wolfe drew his robe tighter, glanced at the clock, and closed his eyes again, clearly prepared to resume whatever digestive reverie I had interrupted. I poured myself the last inch of milk from the glass, warm now, but still serviceable. Walnut Tart, I said aloud, letting the words roll around the room. You ever think pastry might kill you, Wolfe? He didn't open his eyes. I have never been deceived by pastry. You, however, are too easily distracted by froth. I leaned back, watching the rain streak down the tall windows. The brownstone had its hush again, though now it felt like the hush in a theatre just before the curtain goes up. Whoever the woman was, she'd shoved us into the first act. And in this particular theatre, the play always ran the same way. A call in the night, a corpse by morning, and Wolfe grumbling until the clues stacked high enough to tempt him into brilliance. I polished off the milk, set the glass down, and sighed. Fine, we wait. But if the next call comes with a side of pie, I'm putting Fritz on pastry duty. Wolfe, eyes still closed, rumbled low in his throat. Imbecile. And that was that. Midnight in Manhattan, rain on the glass, a deadline humming with secrets, and two men in a brownstone waiting for death to announce itself with a walnut tart. Breakfast in Wolfe's house is not a democratic arrangement. It is not, for example, an event where the participants wander in and pour coffee from a communal pot while making cheerful remarks about the weather. No, breakfast in Wolfe's house is served on a tray, upstairs, to a man who believes that food is not simply nourishment, but ceremony. That man is Nero Wolfe, and the ceremony begins at 9 sharp with Fritz carrying the tray up the stairs as though it were the Ark of the Covenant. On this particular morning, I was already in Wolfe's bedroom chair, waiting. The rain from last night had rinsed Manhattan, but the sky still looked like it had been dunked in dishwater. Fritz came in at precisely 9 with the tray, eggs poached to within an inch of the law, toast that would have made a Parisian baker hang his head, and coffee so fragrant I nearly grabbed it myself. Wolfe raised himself in bed, eyes half-lidded, and accepted the service with the grace of a sultan acknowledging tribute. He didn't speak until Fritz had retreated. You are early, he observed, his voice thick from sleep but no less precise for it. Habit, I told him. Also, I like to see history in the making. A man eats breakfast, a nation rejoices. He sent me a glance that could have curdled the cream. Bah! You are irreverent. That's me, and speaking of reverence, we had a call last night worth kneeling over. I gave him the highlights as a report, not a rerun. The midnight caller, the silver tray, the poison, the 2 words, Walnut Tart. No embroidery. Wolfe doesn't care for it before coffee. He chewed slowly, eyes fixed on me. When he'd swallowed, he said, a walnut tart. That's right. She didn't say sponge cake or jelly roll. She was definite. He spread butter across the toast with geometric precision. Archie, most deaths are not culinary. A woman struck by a taxi on Fifth Avenue is not described as death by hors d'oeuvre. But in cases of poison, food is both instrument and camouflage. That was her word too, I reminded him. Poison. Indeed. He took a sip of coffee, sighing as though the liquid restored him to civilization. The tart, therefore, is not incidental. It is the key, though whether she spoke of it as warning or confession remains to be seen. I leaned back. It could also be code. Maybe she runs a bakery for spies. Password, Walnut Tart. Countersign, Eclair. Pfui. He dismissed me with a flick of his eyes. You trivialize. What else? That's all. She hung up, or fainted, or got dragged away mid-sentence. Whatever the case, we're left with pastry. Wolfe finished the first egg, dabbed his lips with a napkin, and gave me a long, solemn stare. Archie, in a city of millions, women telephone at midnight for many reasons, most of them foolish. Yet she named poison. That compels attention. This morning you will consult the newspapers, discreetly. Look for sudden deaths attended by food or drink, particularly in the society columns where indulgence is advertised as virtue. I nodded. Fine. If it turns out somebody choked on a walnut shell at Shraft's, you'll let me put it down as solved? He ignored that, which was as good as a yes. Wolfe prefers his humour unspoken, preferably in Latin. By the time he'd finished the toast and returned to his state of contemplative silence, I'd had enough of being a Greek chorus. I left him to his coffee and orchids to come, and made my way downstairs. The brownstone was hushed. Fritz was humming in the kitchen, a tune with more Alpine in it than Broadway, and the smell of yeast and roasting meat was already drifting into the hall. If Wolfe ever got poisoned, it wouldn't be from Fritz's handiwork. I slipped into my coat, snapped open the front door, and stepped out onto West 35th. The street was slick with the last of the rain, grey puddles reflecting neon signs that hadn't been switched off yet. A delivery truck rumbled past, trailing steam from the pavement. I crossed to the corner stand where the papers were stacked. The vendor, who knew me as the guy who bought both the Times and the Post before breakfast, handed them over without comment. I tucked them under my arm and returned to the stoop, settling on the top step like a judge ready to pronounce sentence. First stop was the front pages. Wars, treaties, strikes, and one senator caught with his hand in a till. Business as usual. Nothing about walnut tarts. I flipped to the city sections. Fires, robberies, a subway delay blamed on gremlins. Still nothing. Then I tried the society pages, which is where people who have money but no imagination get their names printed. And there it was, in black ink, under a headline that tried too hard. Wine and dessert tasting ends in tragedy. According to the piece, a wealthy importer of wines had hosted a select gathering at his midtown penthouse. The highlight of the evening was a pairing of rare Burgundy with desserts flown in from a patisserie uptown. But the highlight had turned into a headline when the host collapsed at the table, dead before the ambulance could arrive. Guests had been horrified, the widow inconsolable, and the police suspicious. The article didn't say walnut tart, but it mentioned that dessert had been served in 3 varieties: lemon soufflé, chocolate mousse, and yes, walnut tart. I folded the paper, sat for a long moment staring at the rain-polished street, and let out a slow whistle. Either my midnight caller had an eye for detail, or she'd been there. Back inside, I tossed my hat on the rack and carried the paper to Wolfe's office. He was already downstairs, in his yellow chair, looking as though he'd been planted there during the Roosevelt administration and watered daily. "Well?" he asked, as though the word cost him effort. I handed him the paper, folded to the right column. "Our tart has found its stage." He read, lips pursed, then set the paper down carefully. So, the widow is described as distraught, the secretary as efficient, the guests as select, and the police, though unmentioned, will be present with their customary incompetence. I grinned. "Don't forget the pastry chef. He probably didn't sleep a wink last night." Wolfe ignored me. This was deliberate. The woman who called is either witness or accomplice. In either case, she was overcome by fear, hence the abrupt termination. "And what do you suggest we do about it?" I asked. He reached for the bell cord and gave it a pull. From the kitchen came the faint response of Fritz's footsteps. Wolfe leaned back, closing his eyes. "We wait. The police will blunder. The widow will weep. The secretary will conceal. But truth, Archie, is persistent. It will arrive, most likely by your hands, before the day is done." Fritz appeared at the door with a tray of beer, already glistening with chill. Wolfe accepted a glass as though sealing a pact. I looked at the foam rising in the tulip of glass and thought about the midnight call, the woman's frantic gasp, and the body that had collapsed with walnut tart on the table. If this was breakfast, lunch was going to be lively. By the time I got to the penthouse, the body had already been hauled out, which was a pity because corpses have a way of answering questions the living refuse. The doorman, a marble statue in uniform with less personality than his buttons, tried to stop me at the lobby, but a flash of my grin and a suggestion that Nero Wolfe might be interested had him pressing the elevator button like it was a detonator. He didn't like it, but men who stand at doors for a living don't usually like me. The penthouse itself looked like a set piece stolen from the Ziegfeld Follies. Mirrors, chandeliers dripping with crystal, and carpets that could have swallowed a platoon without a ripple. The smell of expensive perfume clung to the air, trying to disguise the faint tang of panic. A handful of guests still lingered, grouped in uneasy twos and threes, whispering the way society folks do when they're caught somewhere between tragedy and scandal. I took a slow walk through the room, eyes doing the collecting. On a side table, a half-empty bottle of Burgundy reclined like a spent lover. The glasses around it told their story, some drained, some abandoned mid-sip. And on the silver dessert cart, 3 plates had been cleared except for crumbs, lemon soufflé, chocolate mousse, and one lonely slice of walnut tart, untouched, its surface glossy under the light. The hostess was the widow now, though she didn't look like she'd been upgraded into mourning just yet. She was tall, dark-haired, and poured into a black satin dress that seemed more cocktail than condolence. She held a handkerchief, but her eyes were dry. When she spotted me, she gave a little smile that had no business being in the same room as her husband's recent demise. "You're not with the police," she said, voice low and smooth, the kind that coils around a man's ears and squeezes. "No," I admitted, "but I have a professional interest in midnight calls about walnut tarts. Archie Goodwin." Her smile widened a notch. "Of course, Mr. Wolfe's legman. You people arrive quickly." "We try to beat the morgue wagon," I said. "My condolences." She waved the handkerchief in a little flutter. "Thank you. My husband was a difficult man, but he did have taste. That's what killed him, I suppose." "Wine or women?" I asked. "Both, probably. But tonight, wine. And that tart. He insisted on having it. No one else touched it. Not I. Not the guests." "That's convenient," I said, watching her eyes. "Convenient?" She tilted her head. "He had allergies. Walnuts gave him headaches. Yet he demanded it. Foolish." That nugget was interesting. If the man never touched walnuts, then why tonight? And why only him? I left her standing by the cart and drifted toward the secretary, who was half buried in a ledger she didn't need to be reading. She was short, trim, with spectacles perched like punctuation at the end of her nose. Her mouth was set in a line sharp enough to slice bread. "Rough night," I said, easing into her orbit. She snapped the ledger closed. "It's worse in the morning." "Meaning?" "Meaning the police will call it a tragedy. The papers will call it society intrigue, and no one will call it what it is." "And what is it?" She leaned closer, her voice a whisper sharpened by spite. "Murder. He didn't fall. He was pushed by poison." "That's so?" I asked, pretending nonchalance. "Seems a bold claim for a secretary." "I kept his appointments, Mr. Goodwin. I saw the threats, the debts, the enemies. I'm not blind." Her eyes were fierce, her chin high, but her hands fidgeted with the edge of the ledger. Nervous courage is a particular fragrance, and she wore it. "Why didn't you mention that to the police?" "Because the police don't listen. They'll write their reports, shrug, and move on. But you and Wolfe, you'll see." I pocketed that for later. The secretary wasn't wrong. Kramer and his men weren't likely to chase society poisonings with enthusiasm. Too much paperwork, not enough satisfaction. I lingered long enough to collect the other whispers floating in the room. A maid, passing with a tray, muttered that the kitchen had been warned. Walnuts gave the boss headaches. Always have. By the time I slipped out, the penthouse glitter had dulled. The rain had started again, soft against the windows, like the city trying to wash itself clean. I took the elevator down, nodded at the doorman, and caught a cab back to the brownstone. When I stepped into Wolfe's office, Fritz was setting the table for lunch, trout in aspic by the looks of it. The smell was enough to make a man forget poison entirely. Wolfe was in his yellow chair, fingers steepled, eyes closed as though in prayer. He opened them when I walked in. "Well?" I dropped into my chair. A society shindig gone sour. The host, importer of fine wines, collapsed after dessert. Witnesses mention a Burgundy and a walnut tart. Only he ate it. The widow is satin and sly, the secretary is sharp and sore, and the guests are chattering like finches. If I had to pick, I'd say the tart was bait. Wolfe grunted, low and disapproving. "A walnut tart. Again. Too precise to dismiss." Exactly, I said. And if you ask me, somebody wanted him dead and wanted it noticed. Nobody else so much as poked at that tart. The wine, though, that's a different story. He opened his eyes wider, studying me. And the widow? Cool as the wine cellar. Dry eyes, wet smile. She knew he wouldn't live to finish dessert, or she's the best actress east of Hollywood. And the secretary? She's convinced it's murder. I'd believe her, if only because she said it with enough venom to curdle milk. Wolfe exhaled, heavy and slow. Murder by food is abominable. It desecrates the kitchen, yet it is elegant, efficient, and in this case almost artful. Poison hidden in walnuts, masked by bitterness. Or, I cut in, maybe the tart was a sideshow. Everyone noticed it, which means nobody looked at the burgundy. That bottle had been opened early. He nodded once. Yes, the distraction of the tart. Clever. But the fact remains, the woman telephoned you at midnight and named it, which means she is entangled. I leaned back. So, what's next? Next, Wolfe said, we wait. The police will blunder, the papers will embellish, and the truth, stubborn and inevitable, will come to us. Meanwhile, Fritz. Lunch is ready, Fritz announced from the doorway, his Swiss accent wrapping the words in silk. Wolfe unfolded himself from thought to appetite. Then we fortify. Archie, you will dine, then you will prepare to answer inquiries. By tonight, someone will knock on our door with either outrage or desperation, possibly both. I watched him reach for his chilled beer, the foam kissing the rim of the glass, and I thought of the widow's satin smile and the secretary's whisper of murder. In this city, death could come by bullet, by blade, or by pastry, but only in Wolfe's world could it arrive wrapped in walnut tart. By late afternoon, the brownstone was quiet enough to make a man believe Manhattan had taken a holiday. The rain had washed the city into a dull shine, the street outside muffled except for the occasional horn announcing some poor fool's impatience. I was in Wolfe's office, legs draped across the red leather chair like I had paid rent for it, working through the sports section and a second glass of milk. Wolfe sat where Wolfe always sat, his yellow armchair, eyes half shut, fingers steepled, looking as if he was on loan from a museum exhibit titled Gluttony at Rest. The peace didn't last. It never does when Inspector Kramer decides he's due his daily ulcer. The doorbell clanged, Fritz's footsteps padded up the hall, and I got up to intercept. Fritz, by sacred canon, never answers the front door, so I obliged, swinging it open to reveal Manhattan's angriest cigar chewer in full storm. Kramer barreled in like the city owed him rent, trench coat damp, cigar clamped in his teeth like it had insulted his mother. He didn't wait for me to invite him. "Where is he?" he barked. "Who? The Pope? Roosevelt?" I asked, shutting the door. "Wolfe," he growled, stamping into the office. Wolfe opened one eyelid, then the other, with the patience of a man being forced to endure a mosquito. "Good afternoon, Inspector. Sit, if you can subdue your turbulence." Kramer yanked the cigar from his mouth and pointed it like a weapon. "Don't you good afternoon me, Wolfe. You've been sniffing around another case, and I'll tell you right now, keep out of it." "Indeed?" Wolfe's voice was syrup poured over granite. "Which case would that be?" "The importer," Kramer snapped. "Collapsed after dessert. Poison confirmed. Toxicology is working it, but it'll take time." I put down my paper and leaned back. Well now, isn't that a coincidence? Wolfe was just meditating on walnuts. Kramer shot me a look that could have boiled my milk. "Don't get smart, Goodwin. I know you were at that penthouse, talking to the widow, talking to the secretary, sticking your nose in." "My nose," I said pleasantly, "is unionized. It goes where Wolfe sends it." Wolfe adjusted in his chair, which for him was the equivalent of another man throwing a punch. "You needn't expend your spleen, Inspector, I am informed, but I am not intruding. Death will visit us all, but it requires context before it requires analysis." Kramer glared at him, cigar bobbing. "Context? A man drops dead after dessert. Doctor says poison. That's all the context we need. And before you start accusing the widow, forget it. She's clean." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Clean? Hardly. Bereaved, certainly. Impatient, possibly. But innocence cannot be inferred from absence of evidence. It requires its own proof." Kramer's growl deepened. "We've got no link to her. Nothing. She didn't touch the food. She didn't pour the wine. She didn't serve the tart. She's grieving." I cut him off. "Grieving? She was dressed like opening night on Broadway and smiling at me over the dessert cart. If that's grief, I'll take a double helping. "Shut up, Goodwin," Kramer snapped, jamming the cigar back between his teeth. Wolfe's voice rolled out, calm as a lecture. "The widow is not exempt from suspicion, Inspector. Opportunity is not only physical proximity, it includes prior arrangement. Who ordered the desserts? Who specified the wine? Who ensured that the tart was placed before the victim and not another?" Kramer jabbed the air with his cigar. "That's police business, and it doesn't involve you." I grinned. "Then why are you here, Inspector? If Wolfe isn't involved, why come tell him so?" That made him flush, red climbing his neck like a thermometer left in the sun. He yanked the cigar out again, chewing the end like it was tough beef. "Because every time there's poison, Wolfe can't resist sticking his fat fingers in. And I don't have time for his games. The lab says the toxin is slow-acting. Could have been in the wine, could have been in the tart. We'll know soon enough." Wolfe lifted a hand, palm out, as though conducting an orchestra no one else could hear. "Permit me, Inspector. The wine is more plausible. The Burgundy was uncorked before dessert, yes?" Kramer frowned. "So what?" "So," Wolfe said, his voice crisp, "that timing is irregular. Wine accompanies a meal. A rare Burgundy would be guarded, opened with ceremony at the moment of consumption. To uncork it early implies foreknowledge, preparation. The tart was merely garnish. The wine, the vessel." Kramer's jaw worked. "You don't know that. You're guessing." "I am deducing," Wolfe corrected, steepling his fingers. "You may dismiss it. Yet the fact remains, only the victim consumed the tart, which is conspicuous. But wine is communal. It is poured, shared, unnoticed, which offers the better cover for poison." The silence stretched. Kramer bit down on his cigar so hard I thought the wrapper might split. I enjoyed the moment, watching him chew that stogie like it was Exhibit A. Finally, he exploded. "Damn it, Wolfe. You sit there in your chair and spin theories while men like me have to prove things. We don't convict on hunches about wine pairings." Wolfe inclined his head, unruffled. "Precisely why you need me, Inspector. My hunches are not hunches. They are the inevitable consequences of logic applied to fact." I added helpfully, "Besides, you'll look good on the stand quoting Wolfe. Makes you sound cultured." "Shut up, Goodwin!" he roared. He spun on his heel, trench coat flaring, and stomped toward the door. "You stay out of it, Wolfe, both of you, or I'll—" He bit off the threat, jammed the cigar between his teeth, and yanked the door open so hard the knob rattled. The slam shook the wall paneling. I turned back to Wolfe, who was already reaching for the bell cord to summon Fritz with the beer. "Well," I said, "that went well. He'll be back in an hour with indigestion and fresh threats." Wolfe exhaled slowly. "He is an intemperate man, but he has confirmed the essential. Poison. We now have motive to examine both widow and secretary with sharper instruments." "Sharp as in subpoenas or sharp as in my tongue?" "Your tongue will suffice, though it is occasionally excessive." Fritz arrived with the beer, the glass sweating, golden foam rising. Wolfe accepted it with the gravity of a man receiving absolution. He took a long sip, set it down, and closed his eyes. I picked up my paper again, smirking. "Wine before dessert. You know, Wolfe, one of these days Kramer's going to strangle you with that cigar of his." "Phooey," Wolfe murmured. "He cherishes it too greatly." And that was the end of Inspector Kramer's grumble, at least for the day. Wolfe doesn't like to say please. He doesn't even like to say thank you unless it comes wrapped in Latin and tied with a bow. But when it comes to Saul Panzer, he at least trims the fat from his instructions. Saul is the one man Wolfe trusts outside the brownstone walls without grumbling, which is why, not long after Kramer's cigar smoke had cleared, Wolfe tilted his head toward me and gave the order. Saul was to follow both the widow and the secretary, quietly, no fanfare. That meant I had the honor of leaving the cozy brownstone, braving the neon jungle, and delivering the sermon in person. It also meant Wolfe could stay where he belonged, sipping his beer and mulling over walnuts. I found Saul at a diner off Lexington that had three things going for it: the corned beef, the coffee, and the fact that nobody ever listened to what you said in a booth. He was halfway through a plate of the first, his cap tipped low, when I slid in across from him. "Busy?" I asked. He looked up, calm as a priest. "Eating." "Good. Keep chewing while I talk. Wolfe wants you on the widow and the secretary. Separate shifts, discreet as always. Saul forked another slice of corned beef and nodded once. Duration? Until one of them hangs herself with a string of pearls or buys arsenic in bulk. His eyes flicked up. You're serious? Dead serious. Poison in play. Wolfe thinks the tart was bait and the wine the weapon. The widow's as cool as shaved ice and the secretary has a tongue like a razor. Between the two, somebody knows more than they're telling. Saul chewed, swallowed, and sipped his coffee. Who first? Start with the secretary, I told him. She's got the look of somebody who could sneak a skeleton out of a closet and still have room for dessert. The widow will be dripping in satin and self-control. She won't move fast. Saul nodded again. Understood. He didn't waste words. He never does. If Archie Goodwin is Broadway, Saul Panzer is Morse code. Precise, spare, and unbreakable. I let him finish in silence, then dropped a couple of bills on the table and slid out. Saul gave me a nod that meant consider it done, and that was all. The city had started to hum again as I headed back. Neon flickered on wet pavement, taxis honked their discontent, and the smell of roasted chestnuts fought the stink of gasoline. Manhattan wasn't beautiful, but she had her charms if you squinted. By the time I got home, Wolfe was in his chair, Fritz hovering nearby with dinner preparations. The room smelled of roast duck and thyme. Wolfe's beer glass sat on the table, frosted and sweating. He opened one eye as I reported. Saul's on it, I said. Excellent. He closed the eye again. That was his version of applause. Evening turned to night, and I passed the hours shuffling papers and teasing orchids that didn't need me. Around 10 the bell rang. I opened the door to find Saul, cap low, coat damp from drizzle. He stepped in without ceremony, shook the wet from his shoulders and followed me to Wolfe's office. Wolfe was waiting. He always knows when Saul's about to materialize, as if there's some psychic cord between them. Fritz brought in coffee for me, and more beer for Wolfe, then disappeared. Saul sat where I pointed, folding his hands like a schoolboy ready to recite. The secretary, he began, voice flat, left her apartment at 8, took a cab to a bar on 8th Avenue, low lighting, backroom tables. She met with a man, rival importer, nervous type, kept looking over his shoulder. What man? Wolfe asked, voice sharp. Name? Carlin. Imports cheap wine, competes directly with her employer. Saul paused. They didn't linger. He slid an envelope across. She pocketed it. No handshakes. Left separately. I whistled low. Bribery, huh? Nothing says guilt like cash in an envelope. Wolfe tapped his fingers together, eyes closed, listening. Describe the man. Tall, pinched, bad suit, worse tie. Smelled of fear and tobacco. Tried not to be noticed, but failed. I leaned forward. And our secretary? Calm, Saul said. Professional, like she'd done it before. That painted a picture. A secretary moonlighting as a payee for the competition, with a boss dead by poison and a tart sitting in the spotlight. It had Wolfe's kind of symmetry. Wolfe opened his eyes and fixed them on me. You see, Archie, the tart was stagecraft. The wine was the vessel, and the secretary, already on the take, had motive to ensure her employer did not linger to interfere. I said, or she's just padding her income. Manhattan's expensive, you know. Phooey, Wolfe's lip curled. You trivialize. This is not petty theft. This is treachery. Money from a rival, secrecy, and a corpse. The concatenation is too neat. Saul didn't argue. He never does. He'd given us the bones, and Wolfe was already draping flesh across them. I asked, think Carlin mixed the cocktail? He had the motive, competition, and the means, if he passed her poison instead of bills. Wolfe rumbled deep in his chest. Possibly, but improbable. Poison requires access, timing, and subtlety. The secretary possessed all three. She arranged the menus, she oversaw the wines, she served her master. Carlin, nervous and inept, would not have dared. Saul nodded once, confirming Wolfe's assessment without comment. Wolfe reached for his beer, sipped, and let the glass clink softly on the table. You will persist, Saul. Observe both widow and secretary. I want every rendezvous, every envelope, every glass lifted to their lips recorded. We require more threads before we weave. Saul rose, tugged his cap, and slipped out, leaving the faint smell of rain and corned beef behind. When the door shut, I turned to Wolfe. "So, that's it? We sit and wait while the secretary pockets envelopes and the widow perfects her pout?" Wolfe leaned back, heavy eyelids drooping. "Yes, to rush is to err. We shall wait. The truth will come to us, borne on Saul's diligence. Meanwhile, dinner." Fritz entered then with the roast duck, its skin crisp and brown, the aroma filling the office until poison and walnut tart seemed like distant abstractions. Wolfe picked up his knife and fork with ceremony. I poured myself another glass of milk and shook my head. Only in New York could a man die by dessert, while his secretary collects envelopes on the side. You'd think crime would get tired of being so inventive. Wolfe took his first bite and closed his eyes. "Crime, Archie, is as inventive as appetite. Both are insatiable." I left him to his duck and beer, wondering if appetite was going to keep leading us back to that walnut tart, or whether the real poison was folded neat inside an envelope marked with someone else's name. If you ever want proof that crime and cuisine are strange bedfellows, you need only spend a morning in Fritz Brenner's kitchen. I wandered in just before 11, and there he was, our resident Swiss maestro, bent over a mixing bowl with the solemn concentration of a surgeon transplanting a heart. The air was warm with the mingled scents of butter, sugar, and ground nuts, a perfume potent enough to make a man forgive Manhattan for all its sins. "Archie," Fritz said without looking up, his accent wrapping the word in velvet, "do not slam the door. The pastry is temperamental." I eased the door shut like it was a bank vault. Heaven forbid I offend the pastry. What's the operation today? "A tart," he said, and then gave me a look that made me wonder if he had overheard last night's call. But Fritz isn't one to eavesdrop. His loyalty to Wolfe is ironclad, and his world is measured in teaspoons, not telephones. Still, there it was on the counter, dough rolled thin, walnuts waiting in a bowl, and a custard base cooling nearby. Fritz reached for the walnuts, gave them a sniff and made a face. "Too old. They go bitter. I must fetch new ones from the pantry." That made me pause. "Bitter, huh? As in sharp enough to make a man wince?" He nodded, already moving to the pantry. "Old walnuts are useless. They make the tart inedible." Now that was a nugget worth pocketing. Bitter could cover a lot of ground, like poison. By the time Fritz returned with a fresher batch, I had the thought clanging in my head like a fire alarm. "Tell me something, Fritz," I said. "If a man wanted to sneak something unpleasant into a tart, say, something lethal, could the bitterness of the nuts hide it?" He stopped, wooden spoon in hand, and frowned. "Perhaps. It would not be noticed immediately. Only later, when it was too late. But why such a question?" "Professional curiosity," I said, and left it at that. I took the idea straight upstairs. Wolfe was in his office, of course, in his yellow chair with a book balanced on his lap and a glass of beer at his elbow, condensation forming neat little rings on the coaster. He looked up as I entered, marking his place with a finger. "Well?" he demanded. I dropped into the red chair. "You can send Fritz a thank you note. He just handed me a clue with a wooden spoon. Old walnuts taste bitter. Enough bitterness to cover poison if a man were so inclined." Wolfe's eyes sharpened, and for Wolfe that's the equivalent of another man leaping from his chair. "Indeed." He set the book aside. "Bitterness is an excellent mask, crude perhaps but effective. The palate is easily deceived when expecting astringency. If the victim consumed the tart, and only he consumed it, then the opportunity was exquisite." That's what Fritz said too, only with more butter in it. Wolfe's lips twitched. Fritz would not tolerate such desecration in his kitchen. But another, less scrupulous hand, yes. Whoever prepared that tart had knowledge not only of pastry but of chemistry. It was calculated. I stretched out, letting the leather sigh under me. "So, we're looking for a baker with a diploma in homicide. Should I start with the patisserie uptown?" "No," Wolfe said firmly. "First ascertain who commissioned the tart. Was it the widow, the secretary, the caterer under instruction? We require provenance before culpability." He reached for his beer, raised it, and drank with the slow satisfaction of a man who never rushed a meal or a deduction. "You will confirm this, Archie. Identify the baker. Speak with him. Do not mention poison. Only inquire about the order, the ingredients, the hands through which they passed." "Fine," I said. "I'll sniff around. If the tart was stagecraft, maybe the baker's receipts will tell us who was pulling the strings. Wolfe leaned back, closing his eyes again, as if the case had already shifted into his pocket. Precisely. The bitter walnut masks the venom, the tart masks the wine, and through the layers of artifice truth waits. You will fetch it. I stood, smoothing my tie, as always, and in the meantime, Fritz is down there rolling dough like he's auditioning for a bakery on Fifth Avenue. If the killer's half as good, we're in trouble. Wolfe's only response was a grunt, which in his language meant both agreement and dismissal. I left him to his orchids and beer, but as I went downstairs the thought nagged me. Murder served under the sweetness of custard, bitterness hiding the sting. Whoever cooked this dish knew that appetite could be a weapon, and that made me hungry for answers, not pastry. Widows come in two varieties, the kind who collapse into their veils and the kind who sharpen them into weapons. When I called at the penthouse that evening, it took about 3 seconds to figure out which kind I was dealing with. The lights were dim, soft jazz curled through the room like cigarette smoke, and she was draped on a chaise in a black satin number that didn't come off the rack at Macy's. In one hand she held a coupe of champagne, in the other nothing heavier than her own poise. She looked me over when the maid showed me in, her eyes cool and feline. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, voice low and smooth. "I wondered if you'd return. You're not the police." "Depends who's asking," I said. "If it's creditors, I'm strictly a bookkeeper. But since you're a lady of leisure, I'll admit it. I work for Nero Wolfe." That got me a flicker of interest, though she masked it with a sip of champagne. Ah, yes, the detective who never leaves his chair. How convenient. "Convenient, sure," I said, sliding into the nearest chair. "Except for me. I do the walking, and you're not exactly across the street." She smiled, polite, polished, and about as warm as a banker's handshake. "And what brings you to trouble a grieving widow at this hour?" I let my eyes wander around the room. The place was swank, every cushion puffed, every crystal glass catching the light. It didn't look like mourning, it looked like waiting. "Curiosity," I said, "about a walnut tart." The smile froze. She didn't spill a drop, but the pause was sharp enough to cut glass. "I didn't touch it," she said quickly. "I never eat such things. Fattening." "Funny," I said, leaning back. "I didn't ask if you did." Her lips tightened, then relaxed again, and the smile returned, this time brittle. Everyone saw. He insisted on it. I warned him about walnuts. He had headaches, terrible ones, but he was stubborn. He said he would eat what he pleased. Now that was interesting. She knew the tart had walnuts. Nobody in that room had said it out loud when I was there. "You must have had an inside track on the menu," I said lightly. "Of course," she replied. "I managed his household. I knew every detail. Do you suggest that makes me guilty?" I spread my hands. "Lady, I don't suggest, I report. Wolfe does the suggesting, and believe me, you wouldn't like it." Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time the satin veneer cracked just enough to show the steel beneath. "You think me cold. My husband is dead, and yet I must entertain questions like this. Do you know what it is to have your life halted by other people's suspicions?" "Sure," I said. "Every time Kramer barges into the brownstone, I lose an evening. But you don't look very halted to me. More like impatient." Her gaze flicked away toward the mantel where a row of photographs stood. "Of course I'm impatient. Do you know what it means to settle an estate, to unravel years of business entanglements? Lawyers, accountants, creditors circling like vultures. I want it finished, quickly." She tossed back the last of her champagne and set the glass down too hard. The crystal chimed against the table. "Funny thing," I said. "Most people wait for grief to wear off before balancing the books." She gave a little laugh, short, bitter. "Grief. My husband was not an easy man. He made enemies, even of those closest to him, especially his secretary." I tilted my head. "You don't like her." "She betrayed him," the widow said flatly. I saw the looks, the little whispers. She was lining her pockets at his expense, and now he is gone, and well, perhaps she should be looked at more closely. She leaned back, as if satisfied she had placed the secretary in my lap. I stood, adjusting my hat. "That's useful, thanks. I'll be sure to mention it to Wolfe." Her eyes flicked over me again, assessing. "Be careful, Mr. Goodwin. You smile too easily. In this city, that's a weakness. Lady, I said, heading for the door, in this city, it's armour. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was at his desk, a globe of beer sweating on the coaster beside him. He looked up when I came in, the expression on his face that of a man enduring the world against his better judgment. Well, he said. She was all satin and smiles, I told him, dropping into my chair. Champagne in hand, cool as ice, claimed she never touched the tart because it was fattening. But here's the twist. She knew it had walnuts. Wolfe's eyes closed briefly, then opened again, sharp. How? She didn't say, just claimed she knew. Said he got headaches from walnuts, but insisted on eating it anyway. She steered the conversation, Wolfe said. You allowed it. I bristled. She's quick, I'll give her that, but I got what we need. She wants the estate wrapped fast, and she's eager to shove suspicion onto the secretary. If she's clean, I'm Joe Lewis. Wolfe's lip curled. You let her direct the tempo. Sloppy, Archie, but revealing. Impatience is a treacherous companion. A woman who thinks she can hurry death and inheritance will reveal herself soon enough. He lifted the beer and drank, eyes fixed on me above the rim. You will press further, but more carefully, no more yielding to satin smiles. I nodded, though privately I thought satin smiles were safer than Wolfe's disapproval. Still, the widow had tipped her hand. She might not have eaten the tart, but she knew exactly what was in it. And in this city, knowledge could be more dangerous than poison. By the time dusk had slipped its fingers through the blinds of Wolfe's office, the day had settled into the kind of lazy rhythm he adored, and I usually despised. The orchids had been watered, catalogues of obscure French cookery had been thumbed through, and Fritz was downstairs coaxing something into a sauce that smelled like sin. Wolfe was enthroned in his yellow chair with a glass of beer sweating on the coaster, the foam shrinking to a neat collar. I sat across from him, reporting like a dutiful stenographer, though with more flair. She said she never touched the tart, I told him, called it fattening, which might qualify as the understatement of the year considering she keeps satin in business. But here's the kicker. She knew it contained walnuts. Nobody announced it at the table, and she never claimed she took a bite. So either she has second sight, or somebody tipped her off. Wolfe closed his eyes briefly, a man communing with the ineffable. The tart was prepared by a caterer, he said. The ingredients were not common knowledge. For the widow to cite walnuts unprompted, she must have known in advance. Knowledge of what one ostensibly avoids is suspicious. I swirled the milk in my glass. So either she was warned, or she was part of the planning committee. Do you want me to drag her back in for a second round? Not yet. A hasty confrontation is premature. Knowledge is evidence, but only if contextualized. We require more. The doorbell saved me from answering. I set down the glass, went to the hall and opened up. Saul Panther stood there, rain glistening on his old flat cap, his face as expressionless as a tax form. He didn't waste words on greetings, just followed me back to the office like a shadow with legs. Saul, Wolfe intoned, straightening a fraction in his chair, which in his language was standing at attention. Your observations? Saul tugged off his cap and held it in his hands. The secretary, he said in that calm, unhurried voice of his, she's been buying Burgundy. I raised an eyebrow. Everybody buys Burgundy, Saul. Some people even drink it. Not like this, he replied evenly. Rare vintage, under the table, cash only, from a distributor on the east side who doesn't ask questions. She collected 2 bottles in the past month. Quiet, careful, didn't want it traced. That pricked my ears like a trumpet blast. I leaned forward. You sure? Saul gave me a look that questioned my sanity. If Saul said a man sneezed twice at midnight, you could set your watch by it. Wolfe's eyes glittered. Excellent. That establishes correlation. The victim's death involved Burgundy. The secretary acquired Burgundy covertly. The conclusion is unavoidable. She procured the means, and if she arranged the wine, it is not unreasonable to suppose she arranged the tart as well. Wait a second, I said. The widow knew about the walnuts. The secretary bought the wine. We're starting to look like a chorus line here. Everyone gets a solo. Precisely. Wolfe steepled his fingers. Murder is rarely a solitary act in appearance, but one mind conceives, one hand executes, one accomplice profits. We must discern which role each plays. Saul slipped his cap back on, ready to fade into the night again. "I'll keep on her," he said simply. "Do so," Wolfe said. "Every movement, every errand. She is a thread that will lead us to the tapestry." Saul gave me a nod and left as silently as he'd come, leaving only a faint trace of rain in the air. I turned back to Wolfe. "So, we've got a widow with a smile sharp enough to cut glass, and a secretary running her own burgundy racket. If I didn't know better, I'd say we were living in a wine list." "You know little and suppose much," Wolfe said dryly. "But yes, the pattern clarifies. The tart was deliberate misdirection, calculated to attract suspicion to a singular dish. The wine, communal and therefore less examined, carried the true venom, and the secretary's clandestine purchases confirm forethought." I let out a long breath. "So she lines her pockets with envelopes from the rival and stocks her cellar with burgundy. Busy woman. But why kill the boss? If she wanted more money, she could have kept both taps open." "Greed is insatiable," Wolfe said, reaching for his beer, "and fear is a sharper spur. Perhaps the employer discovered her duplicity. Perhaps she feared exposure. The motive will reveal itself when we identify the nature of her transactions with the rival." He drank, slow and deliberate, then set the glass down with a faint clink. "You, Archie, will confirm the source of the tart. Who baked it, who delivered it, who paid for it. I will not indulge conjecture without provenance." "Fine," I said, "but don't be surprised if the baker's name is also Panzer. At the rate Saul's working, he might have cooked the tart himself." Wolfe's lips curved in the faintest echo of a smile. "You are flippant, but Saul is thorough. We shall prevail. Now leave me to my beer." I finished my milk in one swallow, set down the glass and stood. The office was heavy with the smells of Fritz's dinner wafting up the stairs. Garlic, rosemary, something braised to perfection. Outside, the city's neon pulse was just waking, but inside, the brownstone was its own little world. Orchids above, sauce below, Wolfe in his chair, and me circling in between, chasing shadows with facts. The secretary had her burgundy, the widow her walnut knowledge. Somewhere in that pairing was a murder composed as neatly as a menu, and Wolfe, sipping his beer with the patience of eternity, was already savouring the conclusion. If you want to know what desperation smells like, take a walk through a wine warehouse owned by a man whose debts are catching up with him. It doesn't smell of cork and oak and fancy burgundy labels. It smells of damp wood, cold stone, and a faint tang of sweat, the kind that seeps out when a man is juggling creditors, competitors, and maybe a conscience. That was the atmosphere when I stepped into Carlin's warehouse on the west side. Carlin was the rival importer, the one Saul had spotted slipping envelopes to our secretary. He wasn't the kind of rival who showed up in glossy advertisements. He was the kind who bought cut rate, shipped in bulk, and dressed like his tailor worked on consignment. The warehouse itself was a cavern, rows of stacked crates, some stamped with foreign ports, some blank. The bulbs overhead sputtered more than they glowed, and the echo of my footsteps came back at me like a reminder I wasn't welcome. Carlin was there, waiting, a man with lank hair plastered to his forehead and a suit that sagged on his shoulders. He had a cigarette trembling between his fingers. He didn't like that I'd called on him, and he liked even less that I introduced myself as Archie Goodwin, assistant to Nero Wolfe. That name is like garlic to some people, scares them, stinks to others, but always gets a reaction. "You've got the wrong man," he said, before I asked anything. His voice was high-strung, brittle. "I didn't poison anyone." "Relax," I told him. "If you had, you wouldn't still be standing here in your own warehouse. You'd be downtown with Kramer chewing your ears off." That didn't settle him. His eyes darted around like the crates might sprout witnesses. "I heard what happened at that party. It's terrible, sure, but I had nothing to do with it." I pulled out my notebook for show and leaned against a crate marked Porto, 1940. "Nobody said you did, but we do know you've been handing envelopes to a secretary who suddenly looks like a prime candidate for accessory of the year. What's the play?" He winced, stubbed the cigarette on the crate, and lit another with shaking fingers. "Look, I admit it, I paid her. But it wasn't for anything like that. I needed information, just shipping schedules, what was coming in, what the big man was ordering, that's all. Competition." I raised an eyebrow. You bribed her for trade secrets, not recipes for poison." "That's right," he said quickly. "She told me when certain Burgundy shipments were delayed, which distributors he favoured, how much stock he had tied up. I'm drowning here, Goodwin. He was crushing me. If I didn't get an edge, I was finished." His words came out in bursts like steam escaping a kettle. I believed him, but only partly. Desperation makes men confess fast, but it can also make them cut out the worst parts. "You realize," I said, "that looks pretty bad from where I'm standing. You're in hock up to your eyebrows, your competitor drops dead after dessert, and you're caught slipping cash to his secretary. Kramer would call that a trifecta." Carlin's face tightened, sweat glistening on his temples. "But I didn't do it. I'm not a killer. I just wanted to keep my business alive." The echo of his words hung in the warehouse, mingling with the smell of stale wine and damp crates. He looked like a man cornered not by the law but by his own mistakes. And yet, there was no guile in the way he said it, no rehearsed indignation, just the raw panic of a man who knows his world is collapsing. I asked him about the wine, specifically the Burgundy. Did he sell any to the secretary? Maybe off the books? He shook his head violently. "No, she got that somewhere else. I wouldn't risk it. Too rare, too expensive. I could barely get my hands on a bottle, let alone enough to share." That checked out. The warehouse was full of stock, but not the kind Wolfe would raise a glass to. This was wine for the masses, not the elite. Carlin's edge wasn't luxury, it was volume. I pushed him harder, circling around the possibility of poison. He swore again, and finally jabbed a finger toward the crates. "Go ahead, look. Tear the place apart if you want. You won't find anything but unpaid invoices and second-rate vintages. I wanted him ruined, not dead. There's a difference." That line stuck. I believed him, mostly. But desperation has a funny way of blurring the lines between what a man says he wanted and what he was willing to do. I closed the notebook, tucked it away, and straightened my hat. "Fine, Carlin. You're a lousy businessman, maybe, but not necessarily a murderer. Still, keep your phone close. If Kramer decides to broaden his suspect pool, you'll be the first swimmer." That put the fear of God in him more than anything. His shoulders sagged, and for a second he looked ready to collapse onto the nearest crate. I left him in his cavern of crates and caught a cab back uptown. The city had put on her neon jewelry for the night, streets slick with reflection, traffic lights bleeding into puddles. Manhattan at night is always two things at once, beautiful and unforgiving. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting in his yellow chair, a fresh beer sweating at his side. The orchids had been put to bed for the evening, and Fritz was rattling in the kitchen, promising dinner at 8 sharp. I gave Wolfe the report, word for word, because with him every syllable matters. "He's desperate," I finished, "sweating over debts, drowning in cheap stock. He admits paying the secretary for shipping schedules, not poison recipes. He looked like a man cornered, but if he's lying, he deserves an Oscar." Wolfe tapped his fingers on the armrest, slow and measured. "Desperate men, Archie, are seldom good liars. They embellish, they tremble, they overstate. A true fabricator is calm. Your description suggests authenticity." "So, you think he's clean?" "I think," Wolfe said, lifting his beer, "that his motive was profit, not homicide. He needed the victim alive to continue the game. Dead competitors are less profitable than living ones. He is culpable of corruption, not murder." I dropped into my chair, stretching my legs. That still leaves us with the secretary juggling envelopes and Burgundy, and a widow who knows too much about walnuts. One of them baked more than pastry. Wolfe drank, eyes half-lidded. "Precisely. The rival importer is merely background. The true players are inside the household, not outside it. Continue pressing." The office settled into silence, broken only by the clink of glass and the faint sound of Fritz humming downstairs. The smell of dinner was creeping under the door, garlic, onions, something simmering slow. It was a reminder that in Wolfe's world, meals were steady, certain, immutable. Murder might knock on the door, but the roast would still be served at 8. I leaned back, watching Wolfe savour his beer, and thought of Carlin among his crates. Maybe he was innocent of poison, but he was guilty of something else, living so close to ruin that every breath reeked of panic. And panic, in this city, was as dangerous as any vial of cyanide. Kramer doesn't send engraved invitations. When he wants you somewhere, he barks down the telephone like a bulldog and waits for the echo. This time the echo was me, standing in the police tasting room on the west side, while Wolfe stayed home with his orchids and his digestion. He doesn't attend crime scenes, tasting rooms or funerals. That's what I'm for. The room itself was cold, tiled, and smelled faintly of vinegar and cheap cigars. Evidence sat on long tables under harsh bulbs, bottles, glasses, silver trays, each tagged with neat little labels. The kind of place where wine went to die. Kramer was there, chewing a cigar into confetti and glaring at me like I'd broken into his cellar. "Goodwin," he grunted. "About time." "You wanted Wolfe, you got me," I said, strolling over. "If you want charm, you called the right man. If you want 300 pounds of genius in a yellow chair, you should have come to 35th. He growled but didn't bite. Instead, he jabbed his cigar toward the evidence table. "There, the Burgundy. You tell your boss what you see." I leaned in. The bottle was dark green glass, elegant enough to make a man thirsty, but something about the cork made me frown. It sat just a hair lower than it should have, edges rough where they ought to be smooth. I bent closer, running a finger over it, and caught a faint irregularity. Whoever had pulled that cork hadn't used finesse. They'd worked it out, swapped it, and jammed it back in. "Hell," I muttered. "This cork's been played with. Someone popped it, added a little something extra, then dressed it back up." Kramer's jaw worked. "That's what the text said. But no prints, no fibres, no nothing. Clean as a priest's conscience." One of the lab men, a thin fellow in spectacles, nodded. And the host's glass carried the brunt. First, fullest pour off the tampered bottle. A faint pencil nick on his stemware marked the spot. "The secretary's handiwork," the tech added. I straightened, meeting Kramer's eyes. "So the tart was a sideshow. The real trick was in the Burgundy." He spat smoke. "You tell Wolfe he was right for once." "Once," I said. "Careful, Inspector, or he'll start charging extra." He growled again and turned away, pretending to read a report he'd probably already memorized. I took my time circling the room, studying the glasses, the silver tray, the neat chalk marks on the floor. It all whispered the same story. Everyone saw the tart, but nobody looked twice at the wine. A magician's misdirection, with poison as the rabbit in the hat. When I finally left, the evening air felt heavy, like the city itself had been corked and was fermenting slowly. The cab back to the brownstone rattled, neon flashing across the windshield like cheap sequins. Manhattan never lets you forget where you are. Inside, Wolfe was in his natural habitat. The yellow chair, a book on his lap, a glass of beer within arm's reach. Fritz had retreated to the kitchen, preparing dinner with the precision of a man building a cathedral out of cream and herbs. "Well?" Wolfe asked, not looking up. I dropped into my chair. "You can stop worrying about the tart. The cork on that Burgundy was swapped. The poison was in the bottle." At that, he did look up, and there was a glimmer in his eyes I'd seen before, the satisfaction of being proven right. He set the book aside and took a slow, deliberate sip of beer. "Of course," he said, "the tart was ornamental. It was too conspicuous, a distraction to occupy the eye while the hand acted elsewhere." Kramer nearly choked admitting it, I told him, but the lab boys confirmed it. Somebody opened that bottle, slipped the poison in, and jammed the cork back. Neat job, but not neat enough. Wolfe leaned back, folding his hands over his middle. "Elegant. A communal drink provides cover. No one suspects what everyone shares. The tart, singular and gaudy, drew attention. Meanwhile, the true weapon passed unnoticed from glass to glass." I frowned. Except only the victim collapsed. If the poison was in the bottle, why didn't anyone else take a sip and keel over? "Dosage," Wolfe said curtly. "The quantity was calibrated. The victim received the portion sufficient to kill. Others received harmless remnants. The secretary who procured the Burgundy would have ensured the pouring was arranged." That name again. The secretary. She was starting to look less like a bystander and more like a conductor. I stretched my legs out. "So, where does that leave the widow? She knew about the walnuts, played dumb about the tart, but if the wine was the weapon, her part's looking thin." "Not thin," Wolfe said, "but secondary. She may have known, or suspected, or conspired. But the secretary handled the logistics. Wine does not uncork itself, nor poison measure itself. She was the agent." I thought back to Carlin in his warehouse, sweating through his lies and half-truths. And the rival importer? Merely the spur, Wolfe said. He provided temptation, perhaps funds, but he lacked the nerve and the opportunity. The secretary's covert purchases of Burgundy tie her directly. The widow's knowledge of walnuts ties her peripherally. Together they form a pattern. One woman acted, the other profited. I shook my head, half in admiration, half in disbelief. You make it sound like a ledger. Debit poison, credit corpse. Phooey! Wolfe reached for his beer. It is simple logic. Human motives are rarely complex. Fear, greed, revenge, seasoned with opportunity. The secretary feared discovery, sought profit, and found a tool in the rival. The widow sought freedom, perhaps indulgence. Both circled the victim like jackals. I let the silence hang a moment, listening to the muffled sounds from the kitchen. The aroma drifting in told me Fritz was finishing something involving garlic and butter, which was enough to make any man forgive the world its sins. Finally, I said, "So tomorrow, what's the play? Do I pay another visit to the widow, or do we let Saul squeeze the secretary until she bursts?" Wolfe closed his eyes. "You will do nothing precipitous. Let Saul observe, let Kramer bluster, let the women entangle themselves. When the time is right, we shall gather them here. The truth, Archie, always ripens. It needs only time." He raised the beer again, savouring it, and I leaned back, watching him. The city outside might have been full of noise and neon, but inside the brownstone the case was already narrowing to a point, sharp as a corkscrew. The tart had been nothing but camouflage, a glittering mask. The Burgundy had carried the poison, and Wolfe, smug as a cat with cream, was already planning the moment he'd lay it out for the world. I drained my glass of milk and set it down. "Fine," I said, "but don't be surprised if the next bottle of Burgundy you order comes with a cork I insist on inspecting." Wolfe's eyes flicked open, disdainful. "Archie, you are incorrigible." Maybe, but I'd seen too many bottles and too many corpses to take a drink on faith. Dinner at Wolfe's house is a ceremony, not a meal. 8 o'clock sharp, the gong of punctuality strikes, and Fritz Brenner produces a spread that could shame most hotel kitchens. That night was no different, except for the cloud of poison and pastry hanging over the brownstone like an uninvited guest. Fritz outdid himself with squab roasted in herbs, a sauce that shimmered with wine but not the fatal Burgundy, and potatoes whipped into silk. Candles glowed on the polished table, reflecting in the silverware. Wolfe, seated at the head, looked as if the universe had been created precisely to deliver this moment. Him, food, and an audience that included me. He forked the squab with deliberate elegance. "Archie," he said, "we have arrived at a conclusion." I'd just finished mopping sauce with bread. "That's convenient. The police usually like conclusions. Saves them paperwork." His eyes narrowed. "Attend. Only a person with access before dessert could have tampered with the Burgundy. The cork was displaced and replaced with care, but such interference cannot occur at table. It required preparation." I set down my fork. "So, you're saying the bottle was already poisoned when it hit the party?" "Precisely." He dabbed his lips with a napkin. "Who oversaw the menus, approved the wines, arranged delivery?" "The secretary."
Nero
She possessed
Wolfe
both
and
motive
murder
and
wine and a
opportunity.
Walnut Tart.
She received illicit payments, she procured rare Burgundy, and she despised her employer. "Despised?" I leaned back. "Plenty of secretaries gripe about the boss. If we start hanging people for that, the city will need bigger gallows." He ignored me as usual. Motive is not merely dislike, it is calculation. She profited from his rival. She stood to gain further by his removal. She alone could ensure the Burgundy passed unexamined until the glass was poured. I stabbed at a potato. "All right. Suppose you're right. Why trot out the walnut tart? If she had the wine rigged, why drag pastry into it?" Wolfe's lips curved in what might have been amusement. "You fail to appreciate strategy. The tart was conspicuous. It contained walnuts, which the victim was known to avoid. It was served in singular portion. Its presence drew attention, suspicion, speculation. While all eyes fixated on the tart, the wine passed unnoticed." "So," I said, "the tart was a red herring. A dessert herring, to be precise." "Phooey." He reached for his glass of beer, raised it, and drank with relish. "Misdirection is an ancient art. The woman contrived it with ingenuity. She placed the tart as bait, certain the victim would insist on tasting it against advice. He did. Thus the stage was set. When he collapsed, suspicion clung to the pastry. Meanwhile, the true agent flowed from his glass. Fritz, who had been clearing the first course, paused at Wolfe's words. His brow furrowed. "A tart as disguise," he said in his soft Swiss tone. "Sacrilege. Pastry is not for poison." "No," Wolfe agreed solemnly. "It is not, which is precisely why it served as camouflage. None but a perverse mind would desecrate food so." I said, "The perverse mind, you mean, belongs to the secretary. But what about the widow? She knew about the walnuts too. She played the part of grieving spouse, but knew details no one announced. She smelled of satin and calculation." Wolfe chewed, swallowed, and gave me a look that suggested he tolerated my chatter only because it kept me from breaking furniture. "The widow's impatience is evident. She yearns to settle the estate, to disentangle herself from creditors and obligations. But knowledge of walnuts, while suggestive, is not dispositive. She may have been informed, she may have suspected, or she may have connived. Still, the act, the substitution of cork, the procurement of wine, belongs to the secretary." Fritz returned with the second course, asparagus with hollandaise, bright and delicate, a splash of colour against the shadows of Manhattan waiting outside. Wolfe tasted it, nodded approval, and continued. "You see, Archie, crime is like cuisine. Ingredients must be measured, timing precise, presentation flawless. The secretary arranged each element, the rival supplied the incentive, the widow supplied cover, but the orchestration was hers." I sipped my milk and watched him savour his beer. "You make it sound like a recipe. 2 parts greed, 1 part fear, stir in resentment and serve with walnuts." "Your levity is tiresome," Wolfe said, "but accurate enough." For a few moments we ate in silence. The food, as always, was superb, though my thoughts kept straying to the secretary with her crisp answers and secret envelopes. Could she really have slipped poison into a bottle without anyone catching on? She had the nerve, sure, but nerve and murder aren't always twins. Finally, I asked, "So what's the next move? You've solved it, but Kramer's not going to slap on the cuffs because you say so over squab." Wolfe leaned back, eyes closing, the picture of satiated intellect. "We wait, we watch. Saul will provide corroboration. The secretary's duplicity will not remain hidden, and when the moment arrives we shall summon them all here. The evidence, layered as it is, will compel confession." "Great," I said. "Meanwhile, I'll keep playing delivery boy to society dames and secretaries who don't like questions. Remind me to demand hazard pay." He ignored that, choosing instead to lift his beer once more. The candlelight gleamed on the glass, the foam hugging the rim. He drank deeply, sighed, and set it down. "Archie," he said, "in this case, as in gastronomy, the garnish is not the substance. The tart was garnish, the wine was substance. Remember that." I nodded, finishing my asparagus. Outside, Manhattan glowed with neon. Taxis splashed through wet streets, and somewhere a woman in satin was counting hours until she could cash in on a dead man's fortune. Inside, at our table, murder was just another course, analysed, dissected, and filed neatly between squab and asparagus. When Fritz brought dessert, a lemon custard light as air, Wolfe regarded it with a faint smile. "This," he said, "is proper." He tasted, closed his eyes, and for a moment the world of tarts and poison was forgotten. I leaned back, spoon in hand, and thought about the secretary with her burgundy purchases and her sharp eyes. The tart had been a decoy. The wine had been the weapon. Wolfe had mapped it all with the precision of a man carving squab. And me? I'd be the one out there tomorrow, confirming the baker, tailing the widow, and nudging Saul when shadows needed watching. But for now, I let Fritz's custard melt on my tongue and enjoyed the moment. Because in Wolfe's house, murder might lurk behind every menu, but dinner was always sacred. When Wolfe calls a meeting, it's not a request, it's a summons. That evening, the brownstone was a stage set for the third act of a play that had already run longer than most of my patients. The yellow chair sat like a throne under the lamplight, the 2 red client chairs gleamed like execution seats, and the air carried the faint smell of coffee from Fritz's kitchen. The orchids were sleeping upstairs, but Wolfe was wide awake, his bulk radiating authority. My job was usher. The widow arrived first, wrapped in black silk and a perfume that could have knocked out a cavalry horse. She sailed into the office, cool as gin, and claimed the left red chair. She crossed her legs deliberately, giving the impression of a woman who never crossed anything by accident. Next came the secretary. No perfume, no pretense. She was stiff-backed, eyes sharp, the kind of woman who made every word an exercise in efficiency. She took the right red chair, as if she'd been assigned to it from birth. The rival importer shuffled in behind, shoulders hunched, sweat already glistening, as if he expected the walls themselves to close in. I gave him the armless chair nearest the bookshelves, partly because it was uncomfortable and partly because he didn't deserve better. He perched there like a man trying not to be seen, which, in Wolfe's office, is about as effective as hiding under a spotlight. Last came Inspector Kramer, chewing a cigar that had suffered more abuse than most suspects. He stood in the doorway, grumbling about Wolfe wasting police time, but he didn't leave. That's the thing about Wolfe. Kramer hates him, but he listens. Fritz entered silently with a tray of coffee, served each of us with his usual Swiss solemnity, and retreated. He never lingers for theatrics. Then Wolfe shifted in his chair, cleared his throat, and the performance began. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice rolling out with the precision of a judge passing sentence, "you are here because a man is dead. Poison, concealed within a bottle of Burgundy, stole his life during what should have been an evening of indulgence. My task is to identify the hand that wielded the corkscrew." The widow arched an eyebrow. "Really, Mr. Wolfe? Must we rehearse tragedy over coffee?" "Madam," Wolfe said, unflustered, "the rehearsal is over. Tonight, we perform the finale." Kramer growled, "Quit the theatrics, Wolfe. Say your piece." Wolfe inclined his head, unbothered. "Very well. The poison required foreknowledge and opportunity. It was administered before dessert by tampering with the cork of the Burgundy. No guest at table could have achieved this unseen. Only one who managed the preparations, who oversaw the menu and secured the wine, could succeed. That person is the secretary." The widow's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile. The secretary, however, did not flinch. Her chin lifted, eyes narrowing. "You can't prove that," she said flatly. "On the contrary," Wolfe replied. "You procured rare Burgundy through clandestine channels. You received money from a rival importer, ostensibly for trade information, but in truth to subsidize your purchases. You possessed both motive and means." Carlin, the rival, shifted uneasily, sweat dripping down his temple. "I told Goodwin. I only wanted shipping schedules. I didn't pay for murder." "Indeed," Wolfe said. "You are guilty of corruption, not homicide. Your desperation made you pliable, but not lethal." The secretary, however, seized the opportunity. She used the wine as her weapon and the walnut tart as her disguise. The bitterness of walnuts suggested danger, and the widow's insistence that her husband avoid them lent credence. Thus, when he collapsed, suspicion settled upon pastry, but the true venom had already passed his lips. The lab-matched residue in the host's glass to the bottle's heel. The first heavy pour carried it, exactly as the secretary arranged, I said. All eyes turned to the widow. She stiffened, her earlier smile vanishing. "You mean to suggest I played no part? How convenient. I was his wife." "You were impatient," Wolfe said, "eager to settle his estate. Your eagerness betrayed you, but it does not equate to guilt. You had motive, but not access. The cork, madam, was not yours to touch." The secretary's knuckles whitened against the arm of her chair. Her voice sharpened. "This is absurd. You have no evidence, only conjecture." Wolfe leaned forward, his bulk shifting like a mountain deciding to move. "Conjecture? No. Evidence. You alone handled the Burgundy before service. You arranged its placement, ensured it was poured by the victim himself. You procured the wine secretly, and when confronted, you deflected suspicion toward the tart, mocking its indulgence, while knowing full well the poison coursed through the bottle." Kramer barked. "So let's hear it from her mouth. Did you do it?" The secretary's composure cracked. Her lips trembled, eyes darting. For a moment, silence gripped the room, broken only by the faint tick of the brass clock on Wolfe's desk. Finally, she spat the words, low and bitter. "Yes," she hissed. "I opened the bottle. I thought it would be swift, unnoticed. He deserved it. He treated me like a servant, used me as a shield against his enemies, and when he found out about the money, he would have destroyed me. I couldn't let that happen." Kramer lunged forward, cigar bouncing. "That's all I need." He yanked her up, snapping cuffs on her wrists. She didn't fight, only stared at the carpet as if it had betrayed her too. The widow exhaled sharply, relief and venom mixed. The rival sagged against his chair, muttering thanks to nobody in particular. Wolfe leaned back, closed his eyes and reached for his beer. He sipped, serene, as though confession was merely another course between dinner and dessert. Kramer hauled the secretary to the door, throwing Wolfe a look that was half gratitude, half resentment. "Damn you, Wolfe. One day I'll solve one without you." Wolfe opened his eyes. "Inspector, you would do well to accept inevitability. Now remove that woman from my house. My digestion awaits coffee." When the door shut behind them, silence returned. Fritz slipped in once more, refreshing Wolfe's cup, then disappeared. I leaned back, stretching. Well, that's that. Another evening's entertainment courtesy of the Nero Wolfe Dramatic Society. Admission free, coffee extra. Wolfe closed his eyes again. "Archie, you are insufferable, yet indispensable. Record the details and ensure Kramer does not bungle the paperwork. The secretary's confession was clear. The case is concluded." I nodded, though my mind lingered on the scene. The widow's smile, the rival's sweat, the secretary's bitter admission. Murder, like wine, had its bouquet, and Wolfe, seated in his yellow chair with a glass of beer, had uncorked it to the last drop. Morning in Wolfe's house doesn't begin with alarm clocks or roosters. It begins with orchids. The rest of Manhattan might be stirring to factory whistles, horns, and the smell of burnt coffee in tenements, but inside the brownstone on West 35th Street, the day comes alive at 9 sharp in the glass-walled sanctum on the top floor. That's where I found him. Nero Wolfe, master detective, professional eccentric, and champion of sedentary existence, standing among his 10,000 orchids as if they were his court, and he the absolute monarch. Sunlight filtered through the panes, softened by the misting system, painting everything with a warm sheen. The air was heavy, thick with the scents of damp moss, exotic blossoms, and a faint hint of soapstone pots. Wolfe's bulk filled a bench at the far end. His eyes narrowed, fingers adjusting the clasp of a plant with the same reverence a priest gives a chalice. He muttered something in Latin under his breath, a line half remembered from Virgil, before raising his head and catching me leaning in the doorway with a glass of milk. "Archie," he said, voice low but firm, "either enter or desist from loitering. Your posture menaces the air." I came in, strolling between the rows of orchids. They stood tall, delicate, proud, each bloom an exotic flair. "Morning to you too. I didn't know air could feel menaced. You should let Kramer know. You've just given him another reason to ban me from crime scenes." Wolfe's lips pressed together in that way of his that could be irritation or digestion. "Inspector Kramer has ample reasons already. Do not provide him new ones." He bent again, examining a cattleya blossom. "This specimen, Archie, suffered a fungal intrusion. See here, the spot on the dorsal sepal. Yet it endured. A reminder that even beauty withstands corruption." "Nice metaphor," I said, sipping my milk. "But if you're about to compare it to a poisoned burgundy, I might drop the glass." His head lifted, heavy and deliberate. "Phooey, you insist on vulgar parallels, but indeed food and flowers share a truth. They are sustenance and ornament, essential and ephemeral. As with life, so with death." "There it is," I said. "Knew you couldn't resist. You've just admitted it. Last night's case hooked you because of dessert." His brows furrowed. "Archie, I was not lured. I was compelled. Murder compelled me, not pastry." I grinned. "Tell that to Fritz when he bakes the next tart. He'll want to know if it counts as professional hazard." Wolfe made a sound deep in his throat, half exasperation, half tolerance, and returned his focus to the orchids. I leaned against a bench, watching him move with surprising delicacy for a man who thought walking from the office to the dining room constituted exertion. Each pot he touched, each petal he inspected, was done with precision, like fitting together the last pieces of a puzzle. We stayed that way for a while, him tending, me sipping, the silence broken only by the quiet hum of the humidifier and the occasional mutter from Wolfe about infernal drafts. Finally he straightened, dusted his hands on a cloth and gestured toward the door. "Breakfast," he said. After Orchids, we took brunch downstairs. Fritz had already set the table in the dining room. Sunlight poured in through the lace curtains, glinting on polished silver. The aroma of coffee, fresh bread and butter filled the air. I took my seat, glass of milk refreshed, while Wolfe settled into his place with the gravity of a man assuming high office. Fritz served him eggs soft scrambled, bacon crisp, but not brittle, and a wedge of toast that could have graced a Parisian café. "Fritz," Wolfe said, "commendable." "Thank you, sir," Fritz replied with his usual quiet dignity. We ate. Wolfe consumed with measured attention, pausing now and again to sip coffee, while I made faster work of my plate. When I'd finished, I leaned back and said, "So it's over. Secretary confesses, Kramer gets his collar, widow gets her estate, rival goes back to sweating over his invoices, and you get to sit here with eggs and orchids, smug as ever." Wolfe's eyes narrowed over his cup. "You persist in confusing serenity with smugness. But yes, the case is concluded. Balance restored." "You make it sound like spring cleaning." "In a sense," he said, "murder disrupts the order of things. Detection restores it. Life resumes." I thought about that, about the widow's red smile, the secretary's cracked composure, the rival's sweat. Life resuming for some meant prison, for others meant perfume and inheritance. For Wolfe, it meant orchids and eggs. For me, it meant another notch in the ledger, another night listening to confessions in his office. Fritz returned then, carrying a tray with a flourish. On it sat a tart, golden crust, glossy surface, walnuts arranged like careful jewels. The aroma of butter and caramel drifted up, rich enough to make a man forget any lingering suspicion. "A walnut tart," Fritz said softly. "Fresh, perfectly safe." I choked back a laugh. Wolfe raised his brows, leaned forward and inspected it as if it were evidence. Finally he gave a nod. "Exemplary. This, Archie, is pastry as it should be. Not desecrated with bitterness, but balanced. It redeems the insult of last night." "Redemption by dessert," I said. "You'll forgive me if I stick with milk." Wolfe cut himself a slice, lifted it with care and tasted. For a moment his eyes closed, and something rare happened. His mouth curved into a genuine smile. "Excellent," he murmured. "Fritz, you honour the craft." Fritz inclined his head, pleased. "It was necessary, sir, to restore confidence." I watched them, these two men bound by food and ritual, one savouring, the other serving, both convinced the world made sense if the table did. I thought about the midnight call that had started it all, about the woman's voice saying Walnut Tart like it was code for murder. Strange how the same words could hang heavy with fear one night and sit light on a silver tray the next morning. The coffee pot steamed, the tart gleamed, and Wolfe leaned back, satisfied. He lifted his beer. Yes, even in the morning, a small chilled glass appeared, Fritz having anticipated the master's routine, and sipped. "Archie," he said, "recall this. Sustenance, whether meat or fruit, wine or tart, binds us to existence. Thus, it also binds us to death. In food, the line between pleasure and peril is narrow. Last night, poison passed that line. Today, flavour redeems it." I raised my glass of milk. "To narrow lines, then?" He inclined his head gravely. The rest of the morning drifted easy. Wolfe returned to his orchids. I lounged with the paper, scanning headlines, waiting for Kramer's inevitable tirade against interference from private detectives. Outside, the city roared and clattered, neon signs still buzzing from the night before. Inside, the brownstone was calm, a world of order, routine, and the faint echo of last night's confession. And I thought, not for the first time, that in Nero Wolfe's brownstone murder might knock at midnight, but it always ended the same way. Orchids in the morning, eggs on the table, and deduction polished off with dessert.